Hey everybody, it's Rothbar's Disciple coming here again with another tutorial video on how to build your own Bitcoin apps. If you guys remember the last video that we had, we created a file that we had a bunch of, we'll say it's tweets here, but it was just a bunch of data points, and we wanted to save the data points in a file. That way it would be saved for the long term. Rather than just saved for as long as we had our program running. As you can see, obviously it's still saved here. Um, what we're going to do today is we're going to pull these data points out of this file, and we're going to hash them. I'm going to show you guys how to do this. Just so you guys know, these first examples are all on strings. They're all on text. It's a little bit easier to hash text. There's less rules on it, I guess. When you're actually hashing bigger files, there's certain rules you have to follow because files might get too big. But anyways, let's just go ahead and get into how you go ahead and open that file. So if you guys remember, what we named it yesterday. We named it the YouTube test file. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to open the file. Okay, so we need to create a variable called open file. Remember, open file is just a variable, and now we're telling it what the variable means. The variable means that we're going to, again, you have to start with your function open, which opens your file, and then you need to write the name of your file, and the name of our file, and again, you write it in quotation marks. Name of our file is YouTube test file. Make sure you get your capitalization correct. Then you put your comma, and then you put the way that you want to open the file. So yesterday we did W and A. Again, W is write a file, and W will, like, if the file already has data on it, you overwrite the data that is on the file. A is append, which is what we use to create the file because we want to save the data and just keep adding to it. If you want to read a file, it's R, okay? Just so you guys know, if you want to, later on, like when I said hashing files rather than text gets a little bit more complicated, you would actually do, I think it's RB, which is read the file in binary, but we have individual data points in that file that we want, so we have to pull those data points out of that file, and we don't want to read it in binary. We want to read the data points that are in that file, so we are going to use R. And again, we went over this yesterday, but you use the plus sign with W and A if the file doesn't exist, but since our file already exists, we don't need any sort of a plus sign, okay? So the next thing that we have to do after we open that file is we have to create a list, basically, or we have to take that data from that file and put it into a new variable, right? So we have our variable that opens the file, but now we need a variable that we take the data from that file and put it into this variable, right? And so I'm just going to call this um, I'll call it data file. We're not actually creating a file, but whatever. So with this data file, we want to read the lines in open file, and we want to put them into the data file, right? So the way that you do this is you call your variable open file, which again just opens the YouTube test file, and then the function we use is dot read lines. And again, dot read lines is one of those functions where I don't really know if you ever put anything in those quotation or the parentheses. You probably do, but we don't need to for our purposes, okay? Now, I'm actually not sure what it'll do if I just say print data file. I'm going to go ahead and try this because um, we actually don't necessarily, or this isn't the way that we are going to do this, but always remember to close the file that you had opened. We're going to see what happens here. Okay, so this is important. So when we create this data file, it creates a list for us. And I've told you before, lists are very important in all the things that we're creating. And you know it's a list because it's in brackets. But look at the strings that it has here, okay? Notice how I said this before. When you add new lines, and again, you need to add new lines into this file. That way they're all different data points. If we didn't have these, oops. If we didn't have these, let me pull this up. If we didn't have the new lines here, each one of these strings would all be on the first line. So then when we wrote in our um, or when we created our data file variable, if we just had openfile.readlines and they were all on the same line, we would only have one data point. But we would need 4 separate data points. But the problem is here, if we look at this, let me open up my hash tool. Um, if we were to actually try to hash this, obviously because there's a new line there, it's different than if you just hash the actual data that we want without the /n there, okay? So we want to have when we hash this, we want to get this second hash without the new line in there. And we'll get there. But I just wanted to show you that even though on this file you don't see the new lines here, the new line still exists within the string, okay? So I'm going to erase this print data file bit here. I'm going to introduce you guys into a new sort of function to some extent, it's the for function, and we're going to write for x in data file, okay? And the reason we're writing for x in data files, we have this list, we got this list of 4 things, and when you write for x in data file, all this means is for every item in data file, we're going to do something to that item, okay? And so now, when you write for x in data file, you can use x as a variable, okay? You could write blah, 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 whatever you want. I'm gonna use x, okay? So when we go here, I'll show you the difference of printing the entire data file and printing just the individual bits of the data file. Now when you print this off, if you look at this, each one of these, like when you print it off, there's a new line in each one of these, okay? There's spaces here. And this is what I mean when I said, like, you got to be careful of these new lines, because not only is it in your list here, but when you print them off individually, it gives you a new line. You know, if that's the new line, I don't know what you call that, new line operator, I guess. But if it's in there, it's going to show it as a new line when you try to print it out individually, okay? So the first thing that we have to do is we got to get rid of this new line. So the way that you do that is you use a function called strip. So we take x, we write period strip, then we write our parentheses. Now we have to tell it what to strip out of x, okay? And we're stripping out the backslash n, okay? Now when we do this, anytime it sees backslash n in the in X, it should strip it out. So hopefully it'll print this out without any new lines. And as you can see, it did it, okay? Now, I've told you this before. I use print just to show you guys what the, or in the shell, what the program is doing. We don't actually want to print that out. We want to create another variable that equals what this is here. And the reason why you do this is it's very simple, is because we want to use that. We want to use this, or we want to hash the stripped version of x. Okay, so we create a new variable called z, and we set z equal to the stripped version of x. So each time that this for, I'll call it a loop. I'm not necessarily sure if it's technically a loop. It's going to piss off some computer science geeks here. But each time it goes through this iteration, because again, when you say for x in data file, it's going to do this to each item in the file. When it goes through this, z will be equal to what we have here. So it'll be these strings without a new line, okay? And that's what we want. So the next thing that we have to do is we have to hash it. Now remember, I said this before, when you're hashing things, the first thing you do is you got to import your hash library. Okay, so we go to the top, import the hash library. All right, so the hash library is imported. Now we can do our hash functions. I'm actually going to, instead of making this z, I'm going to make this y, because we're going to need another variable, and we're going to have z equals hash library, and now we're going to call the function we want, and we want the SHA-256 function. And we want to take the we want to return the SHA-256 hash of y again, because remember, y is the strings without the new line, but because it's a string, we have to insert the encode function. Okay, and then make sure that we got parentheses around all of these, and now we're going to go ahead and we're going to print out z. And just so you guys remember, we don't want these hash objects, right? Hash objects are not what we want at the end, so instead of just printing out Z, we need to change this to hexadecimal form, and you do that by the dot hex digest function. And again, this is empty parentheses here, so hopefully when we print this out, and we get these as our hashes, and if we check this against our hash tool, put these in here, delete that so we can see it real well. If we compare these, you can see they're all the same. Okay, so now not only do we have the ability to add data to a file, we can now withdraw, and this is specifically strings, but so we can add strings to a file, which is just, again, it's letters. You can add letters and words to a file, but you can withdraw those strings from that file and we can hash them. So this one's a little bit shorter video, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. There will be more videos coming out soon.